The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculately manicured lawn of the Harmon estate in the Hamptons. Seth Harmon stood at the edge of his limestone patio, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. He was watching the army of events staff putting final touches on what would be his daughter Grace's engagement celebration. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a self-made man who had built Manhattan's most prestigious construction firm from nothing but grit and vision. "Dad," Grace's voice carried across the lawn. She was radiant in a champagne-colored dress, her dark hair swept up elegantly. "The florists want to know where to place the additional arrangements," Grace said. Seth smiled, gesturing toward the garden entrance. "Whatever your mother planned, sweetheart, this is your day." Bridget Harmon emerged from the house, her designer heels clicking against the limestone. At 47, she still turned heads, though Seth had begun noticing a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. She surveyed the preparations with the precision of a military commander. "The Carmichaels just called," she announced without looking at Seth. "They're running late. I told them we're starting precisely at 6, whether they're here or not." She turned to Grace. "Darling, go check on the place settings. The staff can't seem to handle basic instructions." Grace hesitated, glancing at her father. Seth gave her a reassuring nod. "Go ahead. I'm sure your mother knows best about these things." As Grace walked away, Seth's son Marcus emerged from the house, already looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit. At 24, he was the spitting image of Seth at that age, though lacking the hunger that had driven Seth to success. "The Gleasons just pulled up," Marcus announced, adjusting his tie. "Paul said he has some documents for you to sign, Dad." Seth suppressed a frown. "Business can wait. This is your sister's day. It's just a few signatures." Bridget cut in sharply. "Paul said it's routine property transfers. Better to handle it now before the guests arrive." Before Seth could respond, Claire, his youngest at 21, bounded down the patio steps. "Mom, Mrs. Patterson is asking about the seating arrangement again. She's insisting she can't be at table 6. Bridget's perfectly maintained composure cracked slightly. That woman. She stalked off toward the tent, Claire trailing behind her. Paul Gleason's arrival was announced by the crunch of tires on the circular driveway. Seth watched his attorney of 15 years exit his Mercedes, briefcase in hand. Paul's wife, Susan, followed, carrying a wrapped package that was undoubtedly not just an engagement gift. "Paul," Seth's voice boomed across the lawn. He was tall, distinguished-looking, with carefully maintained silver hair and the kind of smile that had convinced hundreds of clients to trust him with their legal matters. "The place looks amazing." "Susan, doesn't it look amazing?" Susan Gleason, a quiet woman who had always seemed slightly afraid of her husband, nodded. "Wonderful, simply wonderful." Paul clapped Seth on the shoulder, a gesture that had once felt brotherly, but now struck Seth as slightly presumptuous. "Got those property transfers ready for your signature. Just routine stuff. Nothing that can't wait until after the party, of course." "Of course," Seth replied, noting how Paul's eyes darted briefly toward Bridget, who was now berating a waiter about champagne glasses. "Let's put the briefcase in my study for now." Inside Seth's study, Paul placed his briefcase on the mahogany desk with practiced casualness. "Really, Seth, it's just some standard papers. The transfers and property transfer, mostly. Maybe we could knock it out now while it's quiet." Seth picked up a framed photo from his desk, Grace's college graduation, the whole family smiling. It felt like a lifetime ago. "Paul, you've been my attorney for 15 years. More than that, you've been my friend. When did that change?" Paul's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "I don't follow." "You will." Seth set down the photo. "Tonight's about Grace. We'll discuss business Monday." A flash of annoyance and fear crossed Paul's face before his professional mask slipped back into place. Of course. Family first always." The study door opened, and Marcus entered. "Uncle Paul, Dad, Mom wants to know if you're done in here. Guests are starting to arrive." Paul's entire demeanor shifted as he turned to Marcus, and Seth noticed how his son's posture changed subtly, becoming more deferential. "Marcus, my boy, how's the legal internship treating you?" Paul asked. "It's amazing, Marcus," he gushed. "The partners say I'm showing real promise." "That's because you have a natural gift," Paul replied in a tone almost paternal, "and good mentoring." Of course, Seth watched this exchange with growing interest, filing away every nuance. "We should head out. Grace will want photos soon." The garden party was in full swing as the sun began its descent, casting a golden glow over the gathered guests. Seth moved through the crowd, playing the role of proud father and successful businessman. He accepted congratulations, discussed market trends with fellow CEOs, and kept one eye on his family's movements. He noticed how Bridget seemed to always know where Paul was, how their paths crossed just slightly too often to be coincidental. He observed Marcus hovering near Paul's social circle, laughing too loudly at the older man's jokes. Claire, usually so focused on her phone, kept glancing between her mother and Paul with what looked like nervous excitement. "Mr. Harmon," one of the waiters approached with the phone. "There's an urgent call from the Beijing office." Seth excused himself from a conversation about property values and headed toward the relative quiet of the rose garden. The call was brief, a minor crisis that his team could handle. But as he ended it, voices carried through the meticulously trimmed hedges. "Everything's going perfectly." Bridget's voice pitched low, but clear in the evening air. Seth moved silently closer to the hedge. "Patient as ever, my love," Paul's voice, followed by the unmistakable sound of a kiss. "We've been altering Seth's legal documents for years. The properties, the company shares several things in our names now." Seth's hand tightened on his phone, but he remained still and controlled. 25 years of high-stakes business deals had taught him the value of waiting for all the information before acting. "Dad's such an idiot." Marcus's voice joined them, and Seth's stomach clenched. Always so focused on his precious company, he never even noticed. "Our real dad's so clever." The voice was Claire's, and the betrayal was complete. "No one suspects anything. The Jensen property transfer is the last major piece," Paul said. "Once Seth signs those papers tonight, everything will be legally bulletproof. Another year of careful maneuvering, and we can finally drop the act. I'm tired of playing the perfect wife." Bridget's voice dripped with contempt. "Do you know what he said this morning? He actually thanked me for making our house a home. As if I haven't been plotting to destroy that home for years." "Patience, darling." Paul's voice was smug and assured. "Seth's brilliant with business. I'll give him that. But he never understood that true power comes from controlling the legal framework. Every contract, every property deed, every corporate document, I've been quietly altering them all. By the time he realizes what's happened, it'll be too late." "What about Grace?" Claire asked. "She actually loves Dad. She might cause problems." "Grace is too caught up in her own perfect little world to notice anything," Bridget dismissed. "Besides, once everything comes to light, she'll have to choose between keeping her trust fund or staying loyal to her father. Money always wins." Seth heard enough. He moved silently back toward the house, his mind already calculating and planning. In his study, he accessed his private computer terminal, connecting to his estate's security system. The cameras had been his own addition 3 years ago, after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. Bridget had complained about them being tacky, but had eventually given up trying to have them removed. The footage appeared on his screen. Months of midnight meetings in the garden. Paul arriving late at night when Seth was away on business, his children sneaking documents in and out of his home office. Every betrayal captured in high definition. His phone buzzed with a text from his head of cybersecurity, responding to his urgent request. "Multiple unauthorized access points detected in our system, all originating from PG's firm. Hundreds of altered documents found in backdated folders. Want me to lock everything down?" Seth typed back, "Monitor only. Document everything. Full report Monday. He stood at his study window, watching the party continue below. Grace was dancing with her fiancé, genuinely happy and unaware of the devastation brewing. Bridget was holding court with her social circle, playing the perfect corporate wife. Paul was chatting with board members, likely seeking more angles to exploit. Marcus and Claire moved through the crowd, carrying their secrets like badges of honor. Seth pulled out his phone once more, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. Marshall. Seth Harmon. Remember that favor you owe me? I need a forensic accountant's eyes on something. Discreetly. Yes, it's urgent. No, don't send anyone to the office yet. I'll have everything ready for you Monday morning. He ended the call and took a moment to straighten his tie, checking his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him wasn't angry. He was focused and determined. They thought they'd been clever, using his own success against him, twisting his trust into a weapon. They were about to learn why Seth Harmon had survived every attempt to take down his empire over the past 25 years. The party continued below, his family's betrayal hidden behind smiles and champagne toasts. Seth straightened his shoulders and headed back to play his role, the unsuspecting victim, the fool they thought him to be. For now, Monday would come soon enough. Seth, there you are. Grace's voice caught him at the bottom of the stairs. Daddy, it's time for your speech. He hugged his daughter, the only honest thing left in his household. Of course, sweetheart. Can't keep our guests waiting. As Seth walked toward the garden, he passed Bridget and Paul standing slightly too close together. Their confident smiles flickered as he approached. Everything all right, Seth? Paul asked in a solicitous tone. You seemed distracted earlier. Never better, old friend. Seth's smile was genuine, though not for the reasons they assumed. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a well-orchestrated plan. Seth Harmon sat in his corner office on the 48th floor of the Harmon Tower, watching Manhattan stir to life below. The weekend's events had crystallized into cold determination, his mind clear and focused. His executive assistant knocked once before entering. Mr. Harmon, the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee is on line 1, and Marshall Summers arrived early. He's waiting in the conference room. Thank you, Janet. Hold all other calls. Seth picked up the phone, his voice measured and authoritative. Mr. Davidson. Seth Harmon, thank you for taking my call on such short notice. The Ethics Committee chairman's voice crackled through the speaker. Your message mentioned evidence of serious misconduct by Paul Gleason. Given your position in the business community, we're treating this with utmost priority. I'm sending over documentation now. My team has compiled evidence of systematic document alteration, fraudulent transfers, and egregious breaches of attorney-client privilege. Seth's mouse clicked through files as he spoke. You'll find video evidence, digital forensics, and a complete audit trail. A pause on the line. Davidson received the files. Then, my God, this is extensive. Mr. Harmon, this goes beyond simple misconduct. This is criminal conspiracy. I'm aware. I trust the Bar Association will handle this appropriately. We'll convene an emergency panel immediately. Mr. Gleason's license could be suspended by week's end, pending a full investigation. Seth ended the call and strode to the conference room. Marshall Summers, forensic accountant extraordinaire, sat surrounded by laptops and documentation. At 60, with wire-rimmed glasses and a prosecutor's demeanor, he built his reputation by untangling the most complex financial frauds. Seth, Marshall stood, extending his hand. I've been reviewing the preliminary data since your call. This is sophisticated work. They've been building this trap for years. Show me. Marshall pulled up a series of diagrams on his laptop. Paul created a network of shell companies, all registered in your wife's maiden name or through proxy owners. Each time he handled a property transfer for your legitimate business, he created a shadow transaction. Seth studied the complex web of arrows and corporate entities. The Jensen property, that would have been the crown jewel. Marshall pointed to a highlighted section. Sign those papers and ownership of your entire commercial portfolio would have shifted to their control within 6 months. Clean, legal, and virtually irreversible without proving fraud, which is exactly what we're going to do. Seth's phone buzzed with a text from his head of cybersecurity. Full digital forensics complete. Found encrypted communications between PG and your wife dating back 5 years. All documented. Seth forwarded the message to Marshall. Add that to your evidence pile. I want everything ready for the board meeting at 2. The morning passed in a blur of focused activity. By 1:30, Seth's executive team had assembled in the main boardroom. Paul's usual chair sat conspicuously empty. Ladies and gentlemen, Seth began, standing at the head of the table. What I'm about to share will be disturbing. It will also explain why I've called for an immediate audit and termination of all contracts with Gleason and Associates. The presentation was methodical and devastating. With each revealed document, each played recording, the board members' expressions shifted from confusion to shock to anger. This exposure puts us all at risk. Gerald Matthews, head of legal compliance, stated flatly. Every contract Paul Gleason touched needs to be reviewed. Already in progress, Seth assured them. I've engaged Marshall Summers to lead the forensic audit. But there's more. He played the surveillance footage from his home, showing the midnight meetings and conspiracies hatched in his own garden. Several board members visibly recoiled at the betrayal's personal nature. My God, Seth, Patricia Chun, his longest-serving board member, whispered, your own family. Business first. Seth cut off any sympathy. I need unanimous board approval to sever all ties with Gleason and Associates and initiate legal proceedings. The vote was immediate and unanimous. Across town, Paul Gleason sat in his corner office, unaware of the approaching storm. His secretary buzzed through. Mr. Gleason, the State Bar Association is here. They say it's urgent. Paul straightened his tie, confident in his ability to handle any legal challenge. The confidence evaporated as 3 stern-faced committee members entered, followed by 2 forensic IT specialists. Mr. Gleason, the lead investigator began. We have evidence of serious ethical violations and potential criminal conduct. We'll need your computers and access to all client files. This is ridiculous, Paul blustered on. Whose authority do we have? We have documented proof of fraudulent document alteration, misuse of client trust accounts, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The investigator's voice was implacable. Your license is suspended, effective immediately, pending our investigation. Paul's law partners gathered in the conference room, watching through the glass walls as IT specialists began imaging his hard drives. Did you know about this? Thomas Reynolds, the founding partner, demanded of the others. Any of it. Heads shook in mute denial. He has to go, Reynolds decided. Now, before this takes down the whole firm. In the Hamptons, Bridget Harmon was holding court at her weekly tennis club luncheon when her phone buzzed. The text from Paul sent ice through her veins. Bar Association here. They know everything. Seth knows. Delete everything now. Her hand trembled as she set down her mimosa. Around her, her social circle continued their mindless chatter about renovations and summer plans. Bridget's friend Catherine touched her arm. You've gone quite pale. I need to go. Bridget stood abruptly. Family emergency. She was halfway to her car when another text arrived. This one from Marcus. Mom, firm putting me on immediate leave. Claire's text followed seconds later. Dad knows. Henderson Law School called about irregularities in my application. What do we do? Bridget's perfectly managed world was unraveling with terrifying speed. She tried calling Paul, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Her next call was to their private banker in the Cayman Islands. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harmon. Those accounts were closed last week. Mr. Gleason had full authorization. Bridget's manicured nails dug into her steering wheel. Paul had betrayed me. After all our careful planning, he'd taken the money and was probably planning to blame everything on me. Back at Harmon Tower, Seth received another update from his team. He allowed himself a small smile as he read the reports of Paul's suspension, the chaos at his firm, the freezing of offshore accounts. His phone lit up with Bridget's name. He let it ring through to voicemail. Grace appeared in his office doorway, her face pale but composed. "Dad, can we talk?" Seth gestured to a chair. His daughter sat, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light. "Grace, concerned about the wedding. What do you want to do?" Grace met his eyes directly. "I want to know the truth. All of it." Seth pulled out a file and handed it to her. "Read it. Take your time. Then decide." As Grace read, her composed expression crumbled. Mom and Paul. All this time. And Marcus and Claire knew. Yes. The engagement party. They were using it as cover to get you to sign those documents. Yes. Grace's hand shook as she closed the file. "I'm postponing the wedding. Thomas understands. I can't celebrate while our family is torn apart like this. You're not responsible for their choices," Seth said firmly. "I know." Grace stood, straightening her shoulders in a gesture so like her father's. "I'm going to call Thomas' parents myself. They deserve to hear it from me." Seth watched her leave, pride mixing with his cold anger. At least one of his children had inherited his integrity. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Harmon, Mr. Summers has the complete forensic report ready for your review. Send him in." Marshall entered with a thick binder and a grim expression. "It's worse than we thought. Paul wasn't just helping your wife. He was skimming from every account he touched. The man's been running a sophisticated fraud scheme across multiple clients." "Perfect." Seth's smile was shark-like. "Send copies to the Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office. Already done." "Seth," Marshall hesitated, "your wife's involvement is extensively documented. This will destroy her." "She destroyed herself." Seth turned to the window, his reflection hard and clear in the glass. "She just doesn't know it yet." The rest of the week unfolded like a perfectly executed business plan. Paul's law partners, desperate to save their firm's reputation, voted to remove him completely. The Bar Association fast-tracked their investigation, uncovering more evidence with each passing day. Marcus found himself escorted from the law offices, his promising career evaporating as the scandal grew. Claire's acceptance to law school was rescinded, pending an investigation into her role in the document fraud. Bridget's carefully cultivated social circle began to dissolve as details leaked. Her text messages became increasingly desperate. "Seth, we need to talk. Please, let me explain. You're destroying our children's futures." He left them all unanswered. Paul tried calling an emergency meeting with his partners, but they refused to see him. His access cards were deactivated, his emails redirected, his name already removed from the firm's website. In a final act of desperation, Paul showed up at Seth's office unannounced. "Mr. Gleason is here." Janet's voice was professional but concerned. "He's quite insistent." "Send him in." Paul burst through the door, his usual polish cracking. "Seth, be reasonable. We can work something out." Seth continued reviewing documents, not bothering to look up. "Can we? Think about the children. Think about the scandal." Now Seth did look up, his eyes cold. "Like you thought about them when you were sleeping with my wife, when you were teaching my son how to commit fraud, when you were helping my daughter lie on her law school applications. It wasn't like that. Get out." Seth's voice could have frozen fire. "The next time I see you, it will be in court." Paul's face twisted with rage. "You sanctimonious person. You think you're so perfect, so above it all. Bridget came to me because you were always too busy with your precious company to notice her. And now I'm using that precious company to destroy you." Seth pressed his intercom. "Security, please escort Mr. Gleason from the building. Permanently." As Paul was led away, Seth received one final text from his head of cybersecurity. "Found it. Offshore accounts emptied last week. All money transferred to a private account in PG's name only. Your wife got played." Seth allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They had thought him a fool, too focused on business to see their betrayal. Now they would learn that business had taught him exactly how to handle traitors. The sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows through Seth's office windows. In the growing darkness, he reviewed Marshall's final report, preparing for the next phase of his counterattack. There would be no compromise, no negotiation, no mercy. They had chosen their path. Now they would face the consequences. The State Bar Association's hearing room fell silent as the final verdict was read. Paul Gleason, once one of Manhattan's most respected attorneys, stood rigid as his career crumbled with each measured word from the Ethics Committee chairman. In light of overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud, document falsification, and gross violations of attorney-client privilege, this committee hereby orders the immediate and permanent disbarment of Paul Gleason. All documents bearing his signature over the past 5 years are subject to automatic review and potential nullification. Seth Harmon sat in the back row, watching his former friend face the consequences. His new legal team, headed by Alexandra Torres from Wagner and Mitchell, was already making notes on their tablets. Every fraudulent transfer will be reversed, Torres whispered. The disbarment gives us unprecedented leverage. Paul turned, his eyes meeting Seth's. The mask of sophisticated charm had cracked, revealing the desperate man. Seth held his gaze, unmoved by the silent plea he saw there. Outside the hearing room, reporters clustered like vultures. Paul pushed through them, ignoring questions about client losses and criminal charges. His former law partners had already distanced themselves, settling with Seth rather than risk their firm's complete destruction. Seth's phone buzzed with a message from his forensic team. Found hidden partition on PG's laptop. Evidence of systematic embezzlement from his own firm. Sending details to DA's office now. The next few weeks unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Seth's new legal team moved swiftly, leveraging Paul's disbarment to unwind years of fraudulent transfers. Properties, company shares, and assets flowed back into their rightful accounts. In their Hamptons mansion, Bridget received the divorce papers with trembling hands. Her attorney, a third-rate lawyer since no top firm would touch her case, looked grim. "Mrs. Harmon, I must be frank. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Mr. Harmon's team has documented your role in every fraudulent transfer. You're facing potential criminal charges. But the offshore accounts," Bridget began. "Empty." The lawyer shuffled uncomfortably. "Mr. Gleason cleared them out last month. The funds were traced to a private account in his name, then disappeared." Bridget's perfectly maintained facade cracked. "That person," she whispered, "after everything we planned." "Mrs. Harmon," her lawyer cut in sharply, "I advise against finishing that sentence. Let's focus on damage control." Marcus and Claire sat in Seth's office the following day, both looking considerably less polished than usual. Marcus's designer suit couldn't hide his haunted expression. Claire's law school dreams lay in ruins. "Henderson Law has officially rescinded my acceptance," Claire said, her voice small. "They said involvement in document fraud makes me unfit for legal education." Marcus added, "I'll never pass the character and fitness review for the bar exam now." Seth studied his children, seeing not the confident conspirators from the garden party, but two scared young adults facing the consequences of their choices. "You both made your decisions," he said evenly. "You chose Paul over your father. You helped destroy your family for a man who's probably halfway to Mexico by now." As if on cue, his phone lit up with a news alert. Disgraced attorney Paul Gleason spotted boarding a private plane to Mexico City. Claire burst into tears. Marcus slumped in his chair. "Dad, please." Marcus began. "We were stupid. We thought you thought betraying me was clever." Seth cut him off. "You thought Paul's plan was foolproof. You thought wrong." He pulled 2 folders from his desk drawer. "These are the consequences of your choices. You can accept them, or you can earn a second chance." The siblings exchanged glances before opening the folders. Inside each was a detailed program. ethics courses, community service requirements, and strict conditions for future education funding. This is your one opportunity for redemption, Seth continued. Complete these requirements, prove you've learned from this disaster, and I'll consider supporting your education again. Fail, and you're on your own. Grace knocked on the door, entering when Seth nodded. Unlike her siblings, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The Hendersons send their regards, she said. They understand postponing the wedding. Thomas still wants to move forward when the time is right. Seth allowed himself a small smile. You're the only one who maintained your integrity. Grace, I'm proud of you. Marcus and Claire couldn't meet their sister's eyes. Across town, Bridget's social circle was evaporating faster than summer rain. The scandal had spread through Manhattan's elite like wildfire, fueled by the salacious details of her affair and fraud. I simply can't see you at the charity gala, Catherine, her former tennis partner, said over the phone. You understand, of course, the optics. One by one, invitations were rescinded. Country club membership temporarily suspended. Calls went unreturned. Then came the news that destroyed her last hope of salvaging anything from the wreckage. Paul had emptied their offshore accounts days before fleeing to Mexico. He played us all, she whispered to her reflection in the powder room mirror. The face that looked back was older, harder, stripped of its careful polish by betrayal and fear. Her phone buzzed with a text from Paul's Mexican number. Sorry, darling. Business is business. You understand. The same words she used to justify betraying Seth. Seth received the news of Paul's flight with characteristic calm. His security team was already coordinating with Mexican authorities, tracking Paul's movements through camera footage and financial transactions. He's staying at a luxury resort in Cabo, his head of security reported, living large on the stolen funds. Not for long, Seth replied. Contact our friends at the FBI. Remind them about those wire fraud charges. 1 month later, Paul's Mexican paradise crumbled as federal agents surrounded his beachfront villa. The extradition process began immediately, fueled by the mountain of evidence Seth's team had compiled. Back in New York, the divorce proceedings moved forward with ruthless efficiency. Bridget's attempts to secure a favorable settlement collapsed under the weight of Seth's evidence. Mrs. Harmon, the judge stated firmly, given your documented role in this conspiracy, you're fortunate we're only discussing civil matters today. The criminal charges are another matter entirely. Bridget left the courthouse with nothing but a modest settlement. Enough to maintain an apartment in Queens, far from her former social circles. Her phone remained silent. Former friends were too busy distancing themselves from her disgrace. 1 year later, Seth stood at the window of his expanded office in the renamed Harmon International Tower. The scandal had ultimately strengthened his empire, his ruthless handling of the betrayal becoming a legend in business circles. Grace entered, looking happy and centered. Her wedding plans were back on track, stronger for the delay. The Foundation's first ethics symposium is next week. The law schools are particularly interested in using our case study. Seth nodded. The Harmon Foundation for Corporate Ethics had emerged from the ashes of betrayal, turning personal pain into professional purpose. How are Marcus and Claire progressing? Claire's community service at the legal aid office is changing her perspective. Marcus, his team completed the Boston project under budget. He's actually good at this, Dad. Better than he ever was at law. Claire has taken longer to find her way. The rescinded law school acceptance shattered her confidence, but the required volunteer work at legal aid gave her a new perspective. She now runs a nonprofit helping white-collar crime victims, funded partially by the Harmon Foundation, but operating independently. Claire's organization is partnering with 3 more universities. She's turned her mistake into something meaningful. Their redemption had been hard-earned. Seth had maintained strict conditions on his renewed support. Total transparency, regular ethics training, and clear performance metrics. They had learned that trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt through consistent action. The door opened again, and Alexandra Torres entered. She had become Seth's chief legal counsel after leading the team that dismantled Paul's fraudulent empire. "The European acquisition is complete," she reported. "And you'll appreciate this. We just acquired Paul Gleason's old law firm's building. Their partners finally accepted our offer." The irony was exquisite. Paul's former law partners had never recovered from the scandal. Their once prestigious firm had imploded, torn apart by internal investigations and client departures. The building would be renovated and turned into the Harmon Foundation's new headquarters. "Have the foundation send them an invitation to our next ethics symposium," Seth suggested, his voice carrying the hint of satisfied amusement. Alexandra smiled sharply. "Already done." They declined, citing prior commitments. A text message appeared on Seth's phone from his head of security, who still maintained surveillance on key players from the scandal. Bridget attempted to access her old country club membership, claimed it was a misunderstanding when rejected. Left in tears, PG requested prison transfer again. Denied. Claims harassment from other inmates who lost money in his schemes. Seth archived the message without comment. Their suffering held no pleasure for him. It was simply the natural consequence of their choices. Thomas Henderson, Grace's fiancé, arrived for their lunch appointment. At 32, he had proven his loyalty during the scandal, standing by Grace despite his family's initial concerns. Now a partner in his father's investment firm, he had earned Seth's respect through his integrity. "Sir," Thomas greeted Seth warmly. "The Foundation's impact report is impressive. Our firm is implementing the ethics training program company-wide." Over lunch in Seth's private dining room, they discussed the upcoming wedding. Grace had chosen to hold it in the same Hamptons estate where the betrayal had been discovered, a decision that spoke to her resilience. "The rose garden has been redesigned," Grace mentioned. "No more hedges." Seth nodded, remembering that night 5 years ago. "The garden where I overheard their conspiracy has been transformed into an open space filled with flowers. No more hidden corners for secret meetings." Later that afternoon, Seth visited the Harmon Foundation's offices. The walls were lined with case studies, including a detailed analysis of Paul Gleason's downfall titled, "The Price of Betrayal: Ethics, Trust, and Consequences in Corporate Law." The Foundation's executive director, a former federal prosecutor, updated him on their latest initiatives. "We've had requests from law schools across the country. Your story has become the definitive case study in professional ethics." "Any word from Henderson Law School?" Seth asked, thinking of Claire's rescinded acceptance. "They've adopted our full curriculum." Their dean specifically cited the Gleason case as a turning point in their ethics education. The day's final meeting was with his expanded board of directors. The company had tripled in size since the scandal. Seth's decisive handling of the crisis had attracted investors impressed by his integrity and strength. "The European acquisition makes us the largest construction firm in the Western Hemisphere," his CFO reported. "Our ethical business practices have become a major selling point." After the meeting, Seth worked late into the evening, reviewing reports and planning future expansions. His empire had been built on skill and transformed by betrayal into something even stronger. A news alert popped up on his screen. Former Society Queen Bridget Carlton, formerly Harmon, denied loan application. Sources say credit ruined by fraud charges. In her tiny Queen's apartment, Bridget stared at her reflection in a cheap mirror, barely recognizing the woman she had become. Her designer clothes were long gone, replaced by off-the-rack basics. Her once perfect manicure was self-maintained, her hair showing strands of gray. She could no longer afford to color professionally. Her phone, no longer the latest model, showed a message from her current lawyer. Petition to modified divorce settlement denied. Judge cited ongoing evidence of fraud participation. She had tried dating, but background checks in the digital age were thorough. Every potential relationship had ended when her past emerged. The wealthy men she had once attracted now avoided her like poison. In the federal prison's protective custody unit, Paul Gleason sat alone in his cell. The former attorney had aged decades in 5 years, his polished charm replaced by bitter anger. His appeals had been denied, his sentence upheld, his disbarment permanent. His last remaining asset, his elegant Manhattan apartment, had been seized and sold to cover victim restitution. The final insult: it had been purchased by a Harmon International subsidiary. Marcus visited the construction site of his latest project, proudly wearing a hard hat with his team leader badge. He had discovered a talent for actual work, earning respect through competence rather than connections. Mr. Harmon, his crew called him, none of them knowing or caring about his relationship to the company's founder. He preferred it that way. Claire hosted a seminar for fraud victims, her own experience lending authenticity to her guidance. Her organization had helped hundreds of families recover from white-collar crimes. Her past mistake transformed into a mission. In the Hamptons estate, Grace reviewed wedding plans with her future mother-in-law, their relationship stronger for having weathered the scandal together. The Henderson family had come to admire her loyalty and integrity during the crisis. And in his office high above Manhattan, Seth Harmon watched the city lights emerge as evening fell. The betrayal that was meant to destroy him had instead revealed his true strength. His business empire was larger, his reputation stronger, his legacy secured. On his desk sat a framed quote, installed after the scandal: "Trust must be earned, but betrayal must be answered with the full force of the law." It had become the Harmon family's new motto, a reminder that integrity was not merely a virtue, but a force that could reshape destinies. The betrayers had aimed to steal his empire. Instead, they had helped him build a dynasty. The sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows through Seth's office windows. In the gathering darkness, he reviewed plans for his next acquisition. The past was settled, justice had been served, and the future stretched out before him, bright with possibility. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. But wisdom, earned through betrayal, could build something far greater than what was lost. Seth Harmon had learned that lesson well, and so had everyone who had ever underestimated him. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.